It's 9 p.m., and I'm on the grounds of an old airfield at a music festival listening to The Roots. This is Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I went in with a lot of preconceived biases and assumptions, and one by one, they were toppled by the experience that I had. These are the 7 biggest takeaways from my time in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. First, I'm not claiming to be an expert in the Middle East, but I have traveled around much of the region. I lived in Lebanon for half a year, worked in Jordan for a summer, and have spent many months in northeast Iraq. Most of that was through my work as an archaeologist, so I wasn't just limited to major cities. But all that being said, my opinions are just based off of my experience. That leads to my second point, that my experience of Riyadh is just through the perspective of my own identity, a straight white American. I'm sure there are people that would have a different experience because of their gender, race, or sexual identity, but I can only speak for myself. Plus, I was only in Riyadh, and there's far more to the country than that. However, I faced zero limitations on moving around or what I could say. All of that leads to my last point. I'm just trying to report on what I observed. I'm a traveler, not an investigative reporter. If this seems overly positive, it's because my experience was pretty positive. And with that, my first takeaway. Riyadh is dry, but not dull. For those of you that don't know, Saudi Arabia is a dry country, meaning that alcohol is banned. But unlike some other dry countries in the region that allow alcohol in permitted spaces like hotels, once you step foot onto a Saudi plane, and until you leave the country, there is not one drop of alcohol. I'm someone who drinks alcohol regularly. Not a lot, not a little. I just finished dry January. But I'll say the lack of alcohol didn't really bother me, because there was plenty to do in Riyadh while sober. A highlight of my time was visiting Boulevard World. The best way I can describe it is like a combination of Epcot at Disney World, plus themed hotels in the Vegas Strip, minus the alcohol and gambling, of course. It is a massive amusement park with more than 20 zones representing countries from all around the world. There's food and performances and scaled-down versions of famous landmarks. It even has its own mini sphere. It's much smaller, not as high definition, but still pretty nice. What was striking about Boulevard World's attractions, as well as the movie theaters and laser tag in the mall, is that none of this would have existed 5 years ago, before the lifting of the ban on cinema in 2017. But what blew me away even more was right outside of Riyadh, a music festival with 450,000 people.
If you love future rain, let me see those lights in the air.
I had just happened to be in Riyadh the weekend of MDLBeast Soundstorm Festival, so of course, I had to go. It was absolutely huge, on an old Air Force airfield with multiple stages and art exhibits. Basically like any music festival you would have seen in the US or Europe, and with acts that you would see in the US as well. I could not believe that I traveled thousands and thousands of miles from Philadelphia just to see the legendary, world-famous Roots from Philadelphia. On the day I was there, Camila Cabello and 30 Seconds to Mars also played, and it's worth saying their music wasn't censored and their dances weren't toned down. Though I did think both Camila and Jared Leto opted for clothes that covered a little bit more than you would have typically seen in another festival. It's a misconception that Saudi Arabia in 2025 is closed off to tourists and Western music. It's now pretty easy for non-Muslim foreigners to apply for a visa, and you can get a 96-hour transit visa automatically. They loosened up the visa process in September 2019, not long before the pandemic, so people are just starting to realize Saudi is open. But back to the entertainment, when not out at late-night music festivals, the place to be is coffee shops. I went to the world's largest coffee shop, at least in 2014 when it was awarded, late on a Friday night, and if you close your eyes, you would have thought you'd be at a bar or restaurant anywhere else in the world. And that leads to point 2. Nobody sleeps here. Maybe because of the culture of coffee drinking, maybe because of the summer heat, but for some reason, Saudi Arabia gets very little sleep. And that's backed up with data. A study by Sleep Cycle showed that people in Saudi Arabia get 6.5 hours of sleep, which is tied for the least in the world with South Korea. Compare that with New Zealand that gets 7.5 hours, the most in the world. And this does reflect my experience there. The conference I attended ran from noon to midnight. At first I thought it was a typo, but then the talks went up until midnight. I'll say, coming from a sleepier place, I was very tired when the conference ended at midnight. But it was also true other places. At Boulevard World, it was 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and it was packed with families. Again, would not see that in the US. And it was true at coffee shops, where it would be 11 o'clock on a Friday night and people were still drinking their coffee. I don't think anyone in the US would be drinking coffee that late because of the caffeine, which I guess is the point. Let me know in the comments if you're Saudi and you don't get enough sleep, or if you are Saudi and you do get enough sleep, let me know that too. But the lack of sleep isn't just about the hours in bed. It's representative of the energy in Riyadh, plus the 24-hour construction cycle. While I can't speak to the working conditions in Riyadh or Saudi Arabia, you'll have to look to journalists for that one, it was notable that even at midnight, there was a huge crew working on construction right nearby Boulevard World. This does make sense in a country where daytime summer temperatures reach a 45 degrees Celsius or 113 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't really want to be working outside in the middle of the day. Because I was there in the winter, it's hard to fully judge how that works, but that also probably explains part of the reason why people don't sleep so much is because you have to stay up late to avoid the sun during the day. Speaking of construction, that gets to point 3. The growing pains are real. As of 2024, 7.8 million people live in Riyadh. That's an extraordinary population, rivaling New York City, and it has grown significantly in the last 30 years. That amount of growth strains the existing structures and infrastructure. Immediately upon landing, you're confronted with the dual reality of this massive, impressive construction and bumper-to-bumper backed-up traffic. After only a few days, I learned what many in Riyadh already know. The Google Maps has no idea how long it will take places. It says 10 minutes, maybe it takes 20, maybe it takes 30. It says 30, maybe it takes 40, maybe it takes 50. The first few days I was there, it seemed like people were showing up late to meetings. But then a few days after being there, I was the one that started showing up late to meetings. I blame the traffic. One of the ways the government has tried to address the growth and congestion is a new metro system. I want to address one of the comments you guys had on my last video where I wrote every line on the Riyadh Metro, specifically about the amount of time it took to build the system. The metro began construction in 2014 and was planned to open only 5 years later, in 2019. Because of delays, the first 3 lines opened on December 1st, 2024, with the 6th opening a month later in January 2025. From my perspective as an American from Philadelphia, 5 years to open an entire system is beyond comprehension, and even 10 years to build one line is pretty typical, sadly. So building 6 in 10 years, it's pretty impressive. But think about the system in the context of this exploding growth. In the time between when they started building and when it opened, the city grew by 30%, from 6 million to nearly 8 million. The blue line that runs mainly through the central business district was already pretty full within 2 weeks of opening. Riyadh has grown so fast, the streets and the trains can't keep up. It's like Phoenix with Thobes. Riyadh also reminded me of another growing and sprawling city in the desert, Phoenix, Arizona, in the US. My family lives in Phoenix, so I've spent a good amount of time there over the years. At the highest level, literally zoomed out on a satellite, they have some resemblance. Both are in deserts, and they grew outwards from a small water source. Of course, Riyadh doesn't have the hundreds of square miles of typical suburban housing, but much of the infrastructure and design are similar. Walking or driving around Riyadh, a lot of the architecture kind of reminds you of the modern style of the southwestern US or any modern US city. And I went into multiple trendy coffee shops and bakeries that felt like they would fit into a trendy hipster neighborhood. Riyadh's a brand new city, but it's also still founded on history and tradition. They're looking backwards to move forward. As an archaeologist, whenever I travel, I look to find where the archaeological sites are and how well developed they are. In Riyadh, the most famous and important by far is At-Turaif and Diriyah. At-Turaif was the birthplace of the House of Saud, the ruling family of Saudi Arabia, that puts the Saudi in Saudi Arabia. It was the capital of the country until the Ottomans sacked it and conquered Arabia. When Abdulaziz ibn Saud formed the modern Saudi Arabia in 1932, the capital moved to nearby Riyadh. The site was largely abandoned until the kingdom began focusing on it in the 1990s. Eventually, it got UNESCO World Heritage Site designation in 2010. As of 2017, the sprawling Diriyah Gate development started building a new commercial district around the archaeological site, with museums, apartments, shops, restaurants, everything a modern development should have. But all of this makes At-Turaif and Diriyah one of the most fascinating archaeological sites I've ever been to. There are a few archaeological places that occupy this unique space where they're no longer the seat of power, but they represent the origin of the country's founding leaders. You could think about England's Windsor Castle, but the king today has no real power in the castle. There's Japan's Edo Palace, but the emperor is now only symbolic. One of the closest examples, strangely, is actually Independence Hall in Philadelphia, right down the street from me. But I'll get to that and American mythology in a later video. All of that is to say, this is a unique archaeological site where the interpretation of the story directly speaks to the legitimacy of the ruling family and the shared identity of the Saudi people. Visiting the site, I felt kind of conflicted, because it is a very well-preserved archaeological site and that's clearly been invested in heavily. It's easy to get around, it's accessible, there's good signage, it follows a lot of the best practices of archaeological interpretation. But at the same time, it felt so sterile. that they've turned this real place, this important place, into something in between an amusement park and a shopping mall. There were multiple people I talked to that didn't realize it's actually archaeological, which in some ways is good and in other ways is bad. Archaeology is and always has been political, so using history as support for the future is unsurprising. But what did surprise me though was the National Museum. Specifically, how open and proud they were to discuss the pre-Islamic history of the peninsula. Before getting to Saudi Arabia, I may have had preconceptions about how much the country was intent on writing their narrative as just a Muslim country, given that they are literally the Mecca of the Muslim world. But I was surprised they not only acknowledged the pre-Islamic period, but the museum did a really good job of explaining who the different cultures were and why they mattered. But taking a step back, of course it makes sense. If archaeology is political, it's not just about the modern history, but the far back history of the peninsula and the continuation to the modern day that helps establish who the Saudi people are and their identity moving forward. Next week I have more archaeology content coming, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out. Next, this isn't Dubai 2.0. Here's a stat that blew my mind. 63% of Saudis are under the age of 30. Saudi Arabia has a population of 32.2 million, and there are 18.8 native Saudis, so about 60% of the country. Compare that to the Emirate of Dubai, which has grown to be about 3.6 million people, but only less than 10% are Emirati nationals. Sometimes with the announcement of mega projects and press releases, it feels like Saudi Arabia is trying to replicate the model of the UAE, but the feeling on the ground is very different. I think I have this somewhat unique perspective of having visited Dubai, but only once in 2012. At that point, Dubai had kind of just began reaching the world stage, with the Burj Khalifa opening a couple years before. Lots of people asked, where is Dubai when I went? In many ways, Dubai then is where Riyadh is in its development now. But what stands out about Riyadh is that the economy and the culture is focused around Saudi culture, not just attracting Western culture and investment. There were two times when I really noticed this. The first was at the MDLBeast Soundstorm Festival, which had plenty of Western artists, but it was consistently the Saudi and Arab artists that were drawing the biggest crowds. Second was at the conference I attended, where there were a lot of big name US and European speakers, but they drew kind of small crowds compared to the Saudi speakers. I think that's kind of cool, that there is a passion for their culture that comes through, and it's not just about adopting a Western culture. At one point, I was in a car with a new Saudi friend, and he started turning on the radio, playing some Saudi music, some Saudi rap. It was clear time and time again that Saudis are intent on creating a uniquely Saudi culture for the future of their country. Which brings me to my last point. Vision 2030 isn't just a slogan. It's hard to accurately capture the feeling of excitement around the future that people seem to genuinely have. So Vision 2030 was a plan laid out in 2016 about increasing diversification of the economy, growing tourism, improving education, as well as women's participation in the workforce. Pretty admirable goals, but also kind of highfalutin, away from everyday people. You can read about that online or in policy papers, but what struck me is how the goals of Vision 2030 came up in casual conversation, frequently. Not as boilerplate promotion of national ideology, but representative of the hunger and the growth and the future that a lot of these people under 30 really do see. For lots of the population under 30, they've lived most of their adult lives with these goals as the framework for their future. When you think about the changes that have happened over the last 5, 6, 7 years, from cinemas getting legalized to women being able to drive, to the kingdom opening up to tourism, there's a pretty big percentage of the population that has grown up with these reforms and into this new world. I left feeling like Saudi Arabia and Riyadh are a rocket ship, that when I come back, things will have greatly changed. And I'm excited to come back and see that change. For those that feel comfortable visiting the kingdom, I would totally recommend that you go at some point. It's not that hard now. Thank you for watching this video and this whole series about Saudi Arabia. Next week, I'm going to a whole new country in the Middle East, Tunisia. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out. See you next week.